this was a book project. And I started it in 2015. And a number of things happened. The pandemic hit, kind of congeal into a book. And so I've been over the last few years sort of piecing it out into journal articles. And I have a chapter I'm working on for an edited book. And the idea behind the book, I'm just talking about one piece of it today, was to tackle a couple of recurring themes in scholarship. One was around digital inequality, this idea of the digital divide. The second was to kind of continue to explore theories of materiality, which were really central in my first book, thinking about this idea of the digital as placeless, kind of revisiting some of those themes. I was, critical of both of those ideas of both of a digital divide and of the internet as a placeless or immaterial space. And so in order to kind of explore that, I was interested in looking at rural communities in the US as a marginalized group. And I wanted to kind of have a way of connecting different sites together. And so the way I did that was to look at communities that were not just kind of had bad internet and struggled to be connected to the internet and struggled with the kind of rapid change in expectations around connectivity, but who were also, very ironically, hosting core infrastructure of the internet. And so the first place I started doing research in is a area of Northern California, Mendocino County, right along the coast, which has a major subterranean fiber optic cable landing station. And because of the cable landing station, they have fiber optic cables all over the area under the roads. People who live there remember the roads being torn up to lay cables. But those cables take, the data from the coast straight into the cities. And for a very long time, they had very bad internet. People were using satellite internet and yet had fiber optic cables everywhere. That was the first site that I picked. And I spent, a couple of years sort of going back and forth and interviewing people. And that, so I can give you just a sense of the time. That was 2015. And then we had a rather massive political shift in this country, an election in 2016, infamously a big election. Trump was elected president. And I looked at the site that I was studying and I thought, this is a rural area that is very odd politically in the US. It was a place where hippies from the 60s settled and formed communes. There was this back to the land movement, and a ton of people ended up moving to this coastal area. There was also like a kind of a community of ex-tech workers who had second homes or who decided to retire in the area. And so politically, it looked very unusual for a rural area in the US. And I thought I needed another site, basically. A site that was more conservative, that kind of had the histories that many people think of as common in rural areas in the US. And I happened to be from Oregon. And so I knew I had been talking to people about the creation of these data centers. I'd heard about this data center that Google built in the Dalles, Oregon, which is on the Columbia River. And I had heard about a data center, a Facebook data center that had been established in Prineville. And Prineville is a small town right in the middle of the state of Oregon. And it's a small town. It's known for cattle ranching. They call themselves the cowboy capital of Oregon. So that gives you kind of a sense of the culture of the area. They also were a big place for the timber industry. They had a lot of manufacturing. First, they had like wood processing facilities, like lumber sawmills, lumber mills. That industry really declined a lot with over farming and with regulation, or not over farming, over cutting of timber and regulation. But they had a wood products industry, manufacturing, basically. And so I thought that's the place, that's the perfect second place to pick. Again, because the US is big, it's very regional, both of those sites are on the western side of the US, and so there's some distinctive regionality there, but it was a good complement to my first site. So these data centers, there's this trend. I mean, as we move from having all of our data stored on our computers and on disks or on hard drives to data being stored kind of by default in the cloud. And for the big tech companies, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, at some point they realized that they needed to really build their own facilities to handle all this data, their own data and the data they're hosting for people who use their services. And that led to this process of trying to find the right place. There was no reason to build a data center right next to your headquarters. Land there is expensive. They're usually your headquarters. Usually it's like in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area. It's somewhere expensive. So these companies all started to look for the right place to build and run a data center. They don't need a lot of workers typically, so they weren't looking to be next to a highly educated tech workforce necessarily. And so a lot of these data centers ended up in rural areas. And so I was there to kind of understand the data center, but also the rural community itself. And in Prineville, I learned a lot about blue collar labor and work cultures. I learned also about the sorts of jobs that are tied to building and maintaining the internet. So linemen, server technicians, construction. There's, a ton of construction that goes into building these data centers. I learned also about declining industries, about the timber industry, about manufacturing, about cattle ranching, the kind of work culture of that community. And it's not totally clear to me where I will take this work next. I mean, this project is pretty mature. I'm not actively collecting data. I am now analyzing and publishing the work. But like many people, unlike this group, I think, I've become really interested in the environmental burden of data infrastructures. And since I've joined Data and Society, I am becoming tuned into all of the places where that conversation is happening, and also where it's not happening, where it's being carefully avoided. At Data and Society, back in 2018, we actually had a conference on the climate burden of data infrastructure. So that's been a conversation at my nonprofit. And my executive director, Janet Haven, is an appointee to the National AI Advisory Committee, which is giving recommendations to the White House. And so I've been talking to her ongoingly about recommendations, and this is a topic that's come up. It's, but often it gets rooted into an attempt to diffuse concern about the environmental burden of data infrastructures. And so often what that looks like is, people saying, oh, well, AI can help us fight climate change. It's a force for good. It's not a concern. It's a thing that we can use to address climate change. And that is often just like, that's the conversation, and it completely avoids or doesn't talk about, well, what about, all of the electricity, all of the resources going into storing data, processing data, building these deep learning models, Bitcoin mining, So I've been looking at how that conversation happens, where it happens and where it really doesn't. And I'm in the early stages of thinking about this in relation to my own work. I mean, what I have in hand is the data I already collected about what I've heard on the ground from people, the local conversation and rhetoric about the environment and about sustainability. And I also have some data collected from public records. There's some I figured out a way to kind of get a pretty precise sense of how much electricity is being used by the data centers in Prineville using franchise fees. There's a graph that was in one of the readings I circulated, and I will show it to you in a minute here. So as for this talk, it is, follows along with the journal article that I circulated. I obviously won't go into all of the detail, but I'll give you kind of a big picture of that work. And then I'll try to make sure there's room to get into some conversation. And I've set up that interest in the sustainability question. So I would be happy to hear comments, thoughts, pointers to things I should be reading about that. So in looking at this data center in Prineville, I was really looking at the deal that the local local leaders set up with Facebook, and thinking about it from the perspective of rural economic development, which was, a concern of local leaders, of course. They're really concerned about bringing their community out of decline. And there were questions in, realizing this data center deal. There were some real interesting questions from my perspective about efficacy and agency. Like, what were these leaders able to do to make that deal happen? How are rural communities able to bring about big economic shifts like this one, attracting a data center, attracting like a tech firm, and, in a place that previously was known for cattle ranching. And I mean, the big local business for a long time there was the Les Schwab Tire Company, which is a privately owned tire distributor and tire service company. Doesn't seem like a place where Facebook would be like, yeah, let's set up, a facility there. And so part of what I'm arguing is that the story as it's been told, especially in the mass media about data centers, has been foreshortened. This is where we get into discussions around temporality. So I'm going to lengthen that account and give the kind of long view and the big picture of how it came to be. And I think that's actually related to the sustainability interest. That's sort of the right way to kind of adjust our thinking. There's a lot of talk about how we're now living in the Anthropocene, this geological age where human activity is the dominant influence on climate and ecosystem. And part of that recognition is also this urgency around building this longer view and baking it into everything, from policy to economic efforts to cultural, a kind of the culture of how we think about time, because this very foreshortened view is also the one that drives commerce and short-term profits and has proven dangerous. So I have this talk in 3 sections. I'm going to talk about the origins of the data center in Prineville with a big picture, long-term perspective. I'm going to do a little interlude, talk about kind of media coverage and how it doesn't match up with the actual story. And then I'm going to talk about how the local community around Prineville received this development. It was mixed, but on the whole, because of the way local leaders managed it, it was favorably received. And then I'm going to talk about what the current and likely consequences are of this data center project. It's not clear, but I have some thoughts about where I think it could be headed, both in good ways and bad ways. So my method was ethnographic. I spent months in Prineville, hanging out, talking to people. I did 44 interviews all over Central Oregon. Not all those interviews were specifically about data centers. 12 were with local leaders. The local leaders were incredibly available. Like, they were happy to talk to me. They've been very available to the press. They were very available to Facebook. That's one reason Facebook decided to cite the data center there. I also did archival research. I read old newspapers and sat old school, with a microfiche machine, like just flipping through old copies of the Central Oregonian. I did not get into the data center. My project happened a little too late. They had sort of an open door policy for a while where you could just call someone up at Facebook and they would give you a tour, but I came too late for that. So I never got inside. I tried, but I didn't get inside. I did kind of do drive-bys and just get a sense of how big it is. And I had people tell me what they saw when they were inside. So that's how I kind of managed around that access issue. So this section, I'm just going to give you answer the question why Facebook chose Prineville. And to give the kind of historical pointers, the first Facebook data center in Prineville was announced in 2010, and it opened in 2011. There are now up to 11 massive buildings. They keep adding buildings and renewing their agreement with the city and building. And it's been like nonstop construction since 2010. That time period is important because it's coming right at kind of this recession that we went through around that time. Unemployment in that county where Prineville is located, Crook County, was 20%. And they had lost 10% of their population. People had just moved away because there were no jobs. So the arrival of Facebook was greeted with, eagerness, maybe a little apprehension, but mostly just, people were jubilant that a big tech company was coming. At the opening, Mark Zuckerberg actually made an appearance. He flew in. It was not announced. And the mayor of Prineville, Betty Ropey, who's a real character, I had a great time talking to her. She gave him an orange hoodie. She wanted to give him a cowboy hat, she told me. And his people said, no, just give him a hoodie. So Mayor Ropey, she she raised her family in rural Oregon. She'd actually lived, she told me, in a remote forest ranger station in the 1980s, and then moved into town with her 7 children. She liked Facebook. She said, "Oh yeah, I use it all the time. That's how I keep in touch with my kids who are now grown up." She was in her 60s, I think, when I talked to her. So there, this event where they launched the new data center was a big local event. They had a large novelty like button, and instead of a ribbon cutting ceremony, they pressed the like button. And you can see from the Central Oregonian headlines, they were very celebratory. There was nothing critical at all in this news media coverage. The headline, "Thank you for believing in us and being our friend." A lot of just conversations about being friends and friendship and, Facebook friends, Prineville. So what led up to this point? There were a few factors that Facebook, their site selectors, were looking for. Prineville is a dry, high desert climate, which means that it's cold at night. And in the winter, that is a big thing for data centers. They're trying to keep all of those servers that are running simultaneously cool. And so a cooler environment is better for that. The electricity in Central Oregon is very cheap. It is a legacy of the hydropower, federal hydropower program that Franklin Delano Roosevelt initiated in the 1930s. So there was really cheap electricity that was sold at cost, federal electricity, basically. And there was an existing fiber infrastructure. The city leadership was very easy to work with. They answered phone calls in the middle of the night. And there was a tax abatement program, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Facebook was able to get that land without paying full property taxes on it. Okay, so to kind of situate this story, I think you have to go way back to, I will say, 1430. There was a landslide on the Columbia River, which blocked a huge section for a few months and created a river elevation drop. And later in the 1920s, engineers working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers recognized that that would be a good place to do hydropower electricity generation. And as I'd already mentioned, as part of the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt set up this federal program of dams all along the Columbia River. The Bonneville Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, and the Dalles Dam are some big ones. And so they set up the Bonneville Power Administration in 1937, and that became a long-standing source of cheap electricity in the Western region, specifically in Oregon. I lived in Oregon and I've lived in California. Electricity is so much cheaper in Oregon than it is in California. Just my bills are radically different. And it's this legacy from the 1930s of building hydropower dams and selling that electricity at cost. And I think that's important because, there's this sort of bipartisan language in the US government that's very neoliberal now. And the idea that you would invest money in building a massive electricity infrastructure in the way Roosevelt did is politically seems impossible now. And I'm not saying, like, I'm not advocating for hydropower specifically, but just pointing out how that political moment established this infrastructure that is still yielding consequences today, even as political winds have really shifted. Okay, one more important historical fact. In 1985, the Oregon State Legislature was worried about rural economic development, and so they established a rural tax abatement program that required firms could set up companies in these rural areas, and if they committed to hiring a certain minimum level of workers and paying them a particular salary, which had to be 150% of the county average, then they would get these tax abatements that would last for anywhere from 3 to 15 years, depending on how much the investment was. I point out the date, 1985 is when they set that up. And just to give you some perspective, Mark Zuckerberg was a 1-year-old baby at the time. I was a little older than that, but the Prineville, the county that Prineville was in, that program was set up in 1985. Prineville didn't create a rural economic zone or designate one until 2001. It sort of had to, because the other counties that were nearby had set up these rural economic zones. So if they held out and said, no, we're not doing it, we're not going to give people tax abatements, those businesses would just go to these other counties. So it was sort of their hand was forced, I guess. 2001, Facebook didn't exist. It wasn't founded. Yeah, no, that happened a few years later. And then they set up the zone and nothing happened for almost a decade. I talked to a county official who was behind that designation, and he said, we didn't have any idea what was coming. They sort of thought maybe it would be Les Schwab, another tire warehouse, so like wood products. They weren't thinking about attracting high-tech companies in particular. They were just thinking, we better set up the zone and try to attract business. Okay. So I use these eventful moments, what was the date? I said 1430, 1985, 2001. I'm doing that just to kind of muddy the sense of like cause and effect. And I'm drawing in part on work, for example, by the philosopher Jane Bennett, who writes about both materiality and causality. And she says of cause and effect, that the idea of cause is that there's a singular, stable, and masterful initiator of events. And she says in historical accounts, causality is just misleading. She calls it an alien category. So we can look back in hindsight and, assume that there's sort of local leaders deciding this, Facebook deciding this, and there's a clear cause and effect to what brought about these data centers. But I think if you look at the story and you look at what brought it about, there's not like a recipe that any community could use. You couldn't just take this story and plop it into another rural community and replicate it. It's this interesting, coincidental, natural human strings of events that were possibilities of a particular time and place that brought about this end outcome. I'm using that partly because I want to now talk about sort of the view from outside. So data centers have been treated as somewhat controversial in the news media. And I think this op-ed was so clear in its opinion. It was truly an opinion piece, and so wrong, just so off base about what's going on. And this piece was very critical. I mean, the headline was, and just to give you some context, this is about a data center deal in Iowa. And I don't know all of the details about the story in Iowa, but the headline is Apple breaks new ground in squeezing locals for huge tax breaks while offering almost no jobs. I can talk about jobs in a minute, but it's really critical. So the writer says that leaders in the town of Waukee, Iowa, should have hung their heads in shame. Apple took them to the cleaners, and their taxpayers will be paying the bill. The politicians talked as though the data center would put Waukee on the map as a first-class high-tech center. The truth is that it will mark Waukee as a first-class patsy. And another quote, the data centers are especially shiny baubles to dangle before suckers. Very memorable language in this op-ed. And there are a few things I want to say about this. I think there's like a kind of blame being distributed in a certain way. It's a piece of rhetoric. And actually the headline at one point, they changed it, but the headline said, what was it? It was like, it said it was something about yokels. I mean, it actually used this kind of derogatory language for talking about rural people, called them yokels. So it had this sort of this story about slick corporate con artists on one hand, duping, stupid rural hicks who don't understand what they're getting into. And I think this is actually a really good depiction of that foreshortening of the account, like a really foreshortened account. There are human actors making decisions with complete agency and making bad ones, or, manipulating people. And that's not, the media coverage was mixed. I mean, in Prineville, it was like Wired wrote a piece that said that the headline was "How Facebook Saved Prineville, a Dying Mill Town in Central Oregon." So, Facebook as like this heroic figure, and Facebook dons cowboy boots, rides into desert for economic rescue. Another kind of evocative, very pro Facebook headline. But in these kind of public narratives, both the positive ones and negative ones, I saw tropes about tech that science and technology studies scholars critique, related to the agency of actors, these narrow notions of causality, like the political economic context completely erased in this account, that the op-ed piece doesn't talk about any of that. It doesn't talk about rural economic development or what might motivate a town, like local leaders to fall for an Apple deal. It doesn't talk about, like, it just assumes that they think tech is shiny and exciting, and that's why they would go for it. So what I found in Prineville was not unsophisticated local leaders falling for savvy corporate deal makers. I mean, they actually, like the tax abatements that they were using, they didn't decide in Prineville. They didn't set those terms. The Oregon State Legislature built that economic program, that economic zoning program. They set the terms of it. The state had to approve a deal with Facebook. Local leaders did not have that much freedom to say, we'll give you whatever you want, just give us a data center. And you can also see from the data center in Prineville, they set up this economic zone, and it was just like a plot of dusty land for more than a decade. I mean, I think there's an interesting language here around readiness, capacity building, things being shovel ready. In economic development, those are common terms. And that gives you a sense of this kind of waiting. That was in the title of my journal article. You set it up, you build it, you hope they come, you wait, you don't know if it's who's going to show up. You think it's Les Schwab Tire Company, and it turns out that it's Facebook. Wow, well, that's a surprise. But that wasn't intentional. That wasn't the kind of plan or vision that local leaders had in mind when they built that zone. Okay. Speaking of Les Schwab, I grew up in Oregon. We had these ads for the Les Schwab Tire Company on TV. It's a very familiar local figure for me. And it was really interesting to do this project and just sort of get more into the story and details. One thing I want to now argue against, in that op-ed, it talked about, Apple as a shiny bauble, as this kind of attractive symbolic thing. And I just found that there was really no sense in this community that high tech had status or luster or, this kind of language that you often hear associated with tech around like disruption. I mean, these mission statements that tech companies used to really promote. Facebook talked about bringing the world closer together. That language just wasn't important or used much in this community. People actually really weren't talking about young people becoming tech workers or learning to code, or like that. The kind of work culture in this community didn't shift in the way you might imagine with the arrival of Facebook. And I think to understand that, it's helpful to know something about the existing business culture in Prineville. For a very long time, this town has celebrated what I call businessman philanthropists, men, always men, who are of and from the community. And no one better illustrates this idea than Les Schwab of the Les Schwab Tire Company, which he founded in 1952. It never went public. It remained privately owned. In 2008, it was the 324th largest privately owned company in the entire United States. They had a profit-sharing model with their employees. This picture is from the local historical museum. This historical museum is really interesting because they do this kind of promotion of businessmen philanthropists. It's part of their display is like these wonderful local men who ran businesses and took care of their community. And Les Schwab is sort of the epitome of that from the perspective of the local community. Les Schwab, he funded local sports teams. He provided jobs. I call it a form of rural paternalism. And Les Schwab, he has an autobiography, which I read. He really took that very seriously and literally. He thought of himself as a father to his employees. And he admitted that it really did not make sense ultimately to be in Prineville. I mean, they had to like load up trucks full of tires and drive them over Mount Hood, like to get them to the city. Not a smart place to have that business. But he thought of it as this thing he was doing for his community. It was unselfish service to the town. He was trying to provide work. He also owned his own cattle ranch, and he was very much part of that culture. So instead of talking about Facebook as this like exciting new shiny tech company that would disrupt or bring the world closer together, or any of those kind of symbolic visions that you often hear, the language about the data center was very pragmatic. So local leaders talked about, gently, economic diversification. They wanted to reassure people that we're not replacing the old industries with the data center. We're not saying cattle ranching no longer exists. The timber industry is gone. Wood products are over. They're saying, no, now we just have one more thing. We have a stool with 3-4 legs. And this is one leg in the stool that ensures our economic stability. It's one piece of the puzzle. And this is from a city council member, Jason Carr, who said, we want to ensure that other types of industries are functioning well so that people of all types of educational background can get a meaningful job, whether it's in a logging truck or as a technician up at Facebook. The other kind of rhetoric around Facebook that local leaders used was about family wage jobs. And to me, that I listened to that term and I thought there's something kind of gendered about that word, family wage jobs. I mean, it's implying that there's a head of house, like a wage that provides for the whole family. And to me, that implies that there's a stay-at-home parent, there's probably a stay-at-home mom, and there's kids, and there's one person who's bringing in the income. And actually that phrase, family wage jobs, I found goes back to at least as to the 1820s, and it's connected to labor organizing. And what's interesting here is that there's not any talk about labor organizing in this, the way they use this word. It's not about unions. It's about, instead of using a labor union to bring about a family wage job, they're using tax abatements, which is interesting. Like, we're going to bring in Facebook. We're going to give them a really good deal. And then they're going to give jobs to people locally that pay at 150% of the average income. But it was certainly subtly gendered, because when I talked to local leaders about it, they talked, with, regret about the way blue collar working class jobs that paid well just evaporated through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The sawmills shut down, the timber industry contracted, manufacturing jobs went away. The Les Schwab Tire Center was sort of the last place for manual labor, working class jobs that paid decently. And the hope was that the data center would bring back those kinds of blue collar jobs.
Jenny, sorry, I don't know how many slides you've left, but let's just that we sure
wrap
we
it
have
up.
a bit of time to
Yeah.
Fantastic, the material. I love
it. So this is just the last bit of it, just to give you a sense of like questions and doubts. People thought, are there really jobs there? Are the jobs going to locals, or are people coming in from outside the community to take those jobs? Construction jobs don't count. When they're done constructing those buildings, those jobs go away. They don't train people on the job. The only people who get entry-level jobs are like janitors. Those were the kinds of the voices of doubt. And then people who actually did get jobs up there would come in and say, no, actually there are jobs. I'm really glad to have a job that's not in the timber industry. Yes, so I am wrapping up. I'm getting to this last bit, which is about the consequences. And my sense is that the jobs question is really an open one. I mean, those tax abatements are time limited. When they're over, there's no obligation for Facebook to continue to employ many people. Data centers don't employ that many people. I mean, for a rural area, it makes a dent in local unemployment because there aren't that many people living there. But it's a job, it's like in the hundreds of jobs rather than in the thousands. And my sense is that Facebook is not Les Schwab. I don't think they have a real loyalty to Prineville. I don't think they will feel obligated to like support that community at the expense of their bottom line. I don't think we should expect that. The big question, though, is like these enormous data centers, is that enough of an investment that they won't leave? Like, will they stay because they've put in all this money into building these buildings? I think you have Julia Velkova speaking in a few weeks. She wrote a piece about these data center buildings as being monumental but cheap and disposable, which really shifted my thinking. I thought, you're right. They're not like the Frank Gehry headquarters, which they poured a ton of money into building this fantastic space for workers. They're like concrete structures. They house servers. They're not designed for, thousands of workers. And then the last bit, which I will leave us with, because I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is around the climate burden. I think I just have lots of questions. Like if you look at this graph, you can see that from 2000. So this is a graph that shows franchise tax, which is related to electricity. So basically this gray line tells you how much electricity the data center is using. And it starts right there in 2011, and it goes up and up and up and up and up. It's bringing in a ton of revenue, tax revenue to the city, but also you can see that they're using so much electricity, like many times more electricity than the whole rest of the city. And it's so much electricity that now those taxes are greater than property tax for the entire city. And this stops at 2018, so you can expect that they're still just going up. I mean, the struggle I have is that I don't know how much this means, like per capita, like per Facebook user, how much is being spent on data storage and electricity. It's really concentrated here in Prineville. It looks pretty bad. But they're not, I mean, their data centers spread around the world. I just have a hard time getting a picture of how bad this is or how much we should be worried about it. I'm more worried about things like Bitcoin mining or deep learning model training, which are like unbelievably electricity intensive. And there's really no sense of waste. Like what kind of data, what kind of electricity use is a waste when we're talking about data storage, model training, Bitcoin mining? There's no conversation, it seems, about that. It's just like, and the companies talk about it in terms of is it getting better or worse? Like, are we doing better? Are we more green? Not, should we even be doing this? Should we even be training this model? Should we be storing every, blurry photo that you take and upload to the cloud infinitely? Like, does that make any sense? So I'll just leave it there and leave it open to any questions or conversation about sustainability issues, and which are nascent in my work and which I'd love to dig into more going forward.